You know, people think the hardest part of getting old is the aching knees, the blurry eyes, the way winter seeps deeper into your bones than it used to. But they're wrong. The hardest part is watching your own child look you in the eye and tell you that everything you worked for, everything you bled for, now belongs to him. And then he tells you there's no room left for you in the house you built with your own two hands. That's what my son did to me. My name's Richard Lawson, 63 years old, born and raised in Detroit. I spent over 40 years working at the Ford plant on Michigan Avenue. I've stood in the same spot for 12-hour shifts, welding, bolting, breathing in smoke and steel dust, while my knuckles cracked and my hearing went. I thought I was building a legacy. I thought I was laying bricks, not just in walls, but in the future of my family. When my wife, Margaret, died of breast cancer 10 years ago, I promised myself that our son, Daniel, would never know the kind of struggle we went through when we were young. I sold off the life insurance. I saved every overtime check. I skipped vacations. By the time I retired, I had $12 million across retirement funds, savings, and investments. I thought that would keep Daniel safe, give him a cushion so he could raise his kids without ever worrying if the lights might go out or the mortgage might swallow him whole. But money doesn't protect you from betrayal. Sometimes it just paints a bigger target on your back. It started small. Daniel asking me to co-sign on a loan for his real estate ventures in Chicago. He said everyone was doing it, flipping condos downtown, making quick returns. I wasn't naive. I asked questions. He had paperwork, glossy pamphlets, spreadsheets printed in color with logos I didn't recognize. He even brought over a man in a suit one evening, said he was a partner. They talked fast, smiled too wide, and before I knew it, I was signing papers at the kitchen table where Margaret once served Sunday pot roast. That's where I should have stopped it. I should have listened to that quiet ache in my chest, telling me something was wrong. But he was my son, and a father doesn't want to believe his only child would look him in the eye and lie. The first twist came quicker than I expected. A week after I signed, Daniel told me I no longer had to worry about the property taxes on our family house near Ann Arbor. "It's taken care of, Dad," he said, patting me on the back like I was some old dog he'd just fed. I didn't understand what he meant until I checked the mail and found no tax bill that spring. Later, I discovered the house wasn't in my name anymore. It had been quietly transferred, folded into his so-called company assets. I should have stormed into his office in Chicago right then. But instead, I convinced myself it was temporary, that he was just trying to streamline things. That's the word he used. Streamline. Like my life was just another document in his filing cabinet. Then came the second twist, hidden in plain sight. Daniel mentioned, almost offhand, that we still had that old cabin near Lake Huron. He hadn't been there since he was a teenager, back when we used to fish at sunrise and Margaret would fry up whatever we caught. He laughed and said, "Maybe we can finally sell that dump and turn it into something worthwhile." The way he said it made my stomach clench, because Daniel didn't know one important fact. That cabin was still under my name alone. I'd never transferred it, never even updated the deed. It was the last thing Margaret and I bought together before she got sick. I didn't say a word to him. I just nodded. Let him believe it was nothing but a forgotten shack. But inside, something shifted. For the first time, I realized he wasn't just ambitious. He was circling me like a vulture, picking pieces off my life, waiting for me to be too weak or too tired to stop him. The final blow came on a cold March afternoon. Daniel showed up at the house in Ann Arbor with a folder in his hand. He didn't even sit down. He just looked at me and said, "Dad, it's time you moved out." The company needs the property for an upcoming project. My knees nearly gave out under me. I told him this was my house. I told him I laid every brick of the foundation myself back in 1984. He shrugged, handed me a notice, and said, "Not anymore. It's business. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I stood in the doorway after he left, the paper shaking in my hands. Snow was falling, covering the garden where Margaret used to plant her tulips. I thought of all the winters she spent shoveling beside me, laughing when we were young, and I realized then that my son wasn't just taking money. He was taking the very ground I stood on. That night, I went into the garage and pulled out the old wooden chest I hadn't opened in years. Inside were files, keys, and a sealed envelope Margaret had given me before she passed. She told me once, "Keep this safe, Richard. One day you might need it more than you think." And as I held that envelope in my hand, I knew the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I didn't sleep that night. The envelope from Margaret sat heavy in my hands, like it carried her voice across the years. My fingers shook as I slid it open. Inside was a handwritten note and a stack of documents. The note was simple, in her looping cursive. "Richard, if Daniel ever forgets where he came from, you'll know what to do. Don't be afraid to protect what's ours." Beneath it were old deeds, insurance forms, and something I hadn't expected. A notarized codicil to her will that I'd forgotten existed. It stated plainly that her portion of the Lake Huron cabin, plus a substantial life insurance payout, was to be held solely in my name. Daniel had no legal claim to it. I sat there in the garage, the smell of motor oil and cedar filling the air, and for the first time in months, I felt a spark of strength. Margaret had seen further ahead than I had. She'd known our boy could lose his way. The next morning, Daniel called. His voice was smoother than usual, like he'd been practicing in the mirror. He said he had an opportunity, but needed me to sign a few more papers. "Just a formality, Dad." Streamlining. That word again. Streamlining. I told him I'd think about it, and his tone hardened immediately. "Don't drag your feet. Time is money." Something inside me snapped. I drove to Chicago unannounced, a 4-hour ride with nothing but my thoughts, and Margaret's envelope on the passenger seat. His office was in a glass high-rise overlooking the river, all marble floors and leather chairs, the kind of place meant to impress people who didn't know better. When I walked in, Daniel barely looked up. He was on the phone, laughing, tossing around words like liquidation and backers. He waved me into a chair like I was a client waiting for a consultation. Finally, he hung up and leaned back, smug as a cat with cream. That's when I noticed a stack of folders on his desk. One of them had my name on the tab. My pulse quickened. I pulled it closer before he could stop me. Inside were documents showing he had already mortgaged the Ann Arbor house, the retirement funds, even Margaret's jewelry as collateral for massive loans. Loans tied to casinos in Indiana and failed condo projects along the riverfront. He didn't even flinch when I looked up at him. "It's just numbers on paper, Dad." That money was sitting there doing nothing. I'm building an empire I told him he was gambling away, not just my life's work, but Margaret's memory. He sneered and said, "Mom's gone. She doesn't care. You should be thanking me for making sure her sacrifice actually pays off." That was the second twist, sharper than the first. He wasn't just reckless, he was cruel. And for the first time, I saw him not as my son, but as a man who thought I was already dead. I left without signing a thing. On the way home, I stopped in Lansing to see a lawyer, a quiet man named Carter, who worked out of a small office above a diner. He read through Margaret's documents, then leaned back and whistled low. "Your son thinks he's clever, but he left himself wide open. That cabin is untouchable. More than that, with this codicil and the insurance policy, you hold cards he doesn't even know exist." Carter advised patience. "Let him think he's winning. The more desperate he gets, the more mistakes he'll make. Meanwhile, we'll secure the assets he can't touch." So I waited, and sure enough, Daniel's empire began to crumble. The market dipped, interest payments piled up. Within months, I started getting calls. Not from him, but from his creditors, men in suits with voices too polite to be honest. They wanted to know if I would guarantee Daniel's debts. That was the third twist. The sharks weren't circling him anymore. They were circling me. Because in their eyes, I was the foundation of his empire. And when they realized I wasn't bailing him out, they started circling closer to him. One evening I drove out to the Lake Huron cabin to clear my head. The air was sharp with pine, the lake black under the stars. I lit the fireplace, poured myself a glass of Jack Daniels, and sat on the old leather armchair Margaret loved. On the mantel was a photograph of Daniel as a boy, holding up a perch he'd caught with both hands, grinning from ear to ear. I stared at it until my eyes burned. How had that boy turned into the man who threw me out of my own house? Was it my fault for giving him too much? For shielding him from the hard winters I thought would break him? As the fire crackled, my phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. "Dad, we need to talk. Urgent. If you don't help me, everything will collapse. They'll come after me. Please." I stared at the screen, my hand trembling. For the first time, he wasn't arrogant. He was afraid. And in that fear, I saw an opening. Because what he didn't know was that I had already bought up one of his defaulted loans through Carter's firm. Legally, I wasn't just his father anymore. I was his creditor. And the next time he came crawling back, I was going to make sure he learned exactly what it felt like to lose everything. When Daniel finally showed up at the Lake Huron cabin, he looked nothing like the polished businessman I'd seen in that Chicago office. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, and the way he slammed his BMW door shut told me desperation had eaten him raw. He walked straight in without knocking, like he still owned every room I breathed in. "Dad, I need cash." Now his voice cracked halfway through. "They're threatening me." "I'll lose everything." I leaned back in the chair by the fire, the old leather groaning under my weight, and let his words hang in the air. I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I poured myself a glass of bourbon, the smell of oak and caramel curling through the room. I raised the glass slowly. "Sit down, Daniel." That was the first shift of power. For the first time, he obeyed. I asked him how much he owed. He hesitated, then muttered, "7 million, maybe more, but if you cover the interest, I can fix this." His voice trembled like he was asking for a glass of water, not a fortune. That was when I revealed the first twist. "You don't owe the banks anymore," I said. "You owe me." I slid a folder across the table. The loan Carter had quietly transferred into my name. His face drained white as he flipped through the documents. His own father was now his creditor. "You wouldn't do this to me," he whispered. But his eyes told me he already knew I would. He tried bargaining, promises of profit, shares in phantom projects, even guilt trips about family. "Mom would never forgive you," he snapped at one point. And that's when I pulled out Margaret's codicil. I laid it on the table like a judge's gavel. "Your mother saw this day coming," I said. "She left everything in my name because she knew you'd sell her memory to the highest bidder." Daniel's mask cracked. For a moment he looked like a boy again, cornered and terrified. But then he hardened, jaw clenched, and he stood up so fast, the chair tipped backward. "If you think you can ruin me, you're wrong. I still have assets, connections. You'll regret this." He stormed out, tires spitting gravel as he sped down the dirt road. But his words didn't shake me. If anything, they confirmed what Carter had said. The more desperate he became, the more reckless his moves would be. And I was right. A week later, I got a call from one of Daniel's so-called partners. The man's tone was sharp, like steel under velvet. "Mr. Lawson, your son owes us, and if he can't pay, maybe you'd like to settle his accounts. I'm sure you don't want this to get ugly." That was the second twist. Daniel hadn't just dragged me into financial ruin. He'd tied himself to people who didn't send polite letters when debts came due, people who knocked at doors in the middle of the night. I drove back to Ann Arbor to check the old house. The tulips Margaret planted had been trampled, the shutters hung crooked, and the place looked like a ghost. I stood there in the yard, realizing my son had turned a home into a liability. Neighbors glanced at me with pity, whispers carrying across the snow. For the first time in my life, shame burned hotter than anger. Shame for raising a man who thought betrayal was business. Shame for giving him the tools to bury me. But under that shame, a fire grew. I wasn't just going to defend what was left. I was going to take back everything. The third twist revealed itself when Carter called. Richard, we found something in the filings. Your son's been hiding assets under shell companies. Cars, watches, even property in his girlfriend's name. But here's the kicker. He listed you as a guarantor without your knowledge. Legally, you can contest it. And if you do, those assets could revert to you. I felt my pulse hammer in my temples. Daniel hadn't just stolen from me, he'd used my name as his shield, and that gave me the weapon I needed. That night, I sat in the cabin alone, the firelight flickering against the old family photographs. I thought of Margaret's smile, of the years of sacrifice, of the way Daniel once begged me to teach him how to ride a bike down Maple Street. I thought of the boy he had been and the man he had become. I raised my glass and whispered, "You made me your enemy, son. Now I'll show you what that means." And just as I let the words leave my lips, headlights cut across the cabin window. A car pulled up, engine running, lights glaring. My phone buzzed. A single text lit the screen. "We need to talk. Come outside." Alone I froze, the bourbon burning in my throat. Because the number wasn't Daniel's. It was one of his creditors. The knock on the cabin door was hard enough to rattle the frame. I set my glass down, heart thudding, and opened it just a crack. Two men stood there, both in dark coats, their breath fogging in the cold night air. One was tall and lean with sharp eyes, the other broad-shouldered, his jaw clenched tight. "Mr. Lawson?" the tall one asked. "We represent parties your son owes. He told us you'd make this right. I didn't flinch. My son told you. Wrong." They exchanged a look. The broad-shouldered man stepped closer, his boots crunching the snow. "Careful, old man." Debts have a way of traveling down family lines. I let them in, but not because I was afraid. I wanted them to see what I had prepared. On the table beside the bourbon sat the loan documents Carter had secured in my name. Proof that I wasn't just some retiree with a sob story. I was the legal owner of one of Daniel's biggest debts. I slid the folder toward them. "Your problem isn't with me anymore. It's with him, and legally I'm one of you now. I own part of his debt. That means if you come after me, you're crossing the wrong line." For a moment, silence thickened the room. Then the tall one chuckled, low and dangerous. "Smart man. Smarter than your boy, anyway. But let's see if you're willing to use that against your own flesh and blood." That was the first twist. They didn't want my money. They wanted to test if I'd break Daniel myself. When they left, headlights fading into the trees, I sank back into the chair, my pulse racing. Margaret's voice echoed in my mind. "Don't be afraid to protect what's ours." I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry. And anger, I realized, could be sharper than fear. The next morning I went into town, into a courthouse I hadn't stepped foot in since serving jury duty 30 years ago. Carter met me there, his briefcase stuffed with files. Together, we filed a petition to freeze Daniel's remaining assets. Not out of spite, but because he had forged my signature as guarantor. That gave me not only the right, but the duty to expose him. The second twist came as we left the courthouse. Carter pulled me aside. "Richard, you should know something. Your son's girlfriend, the one tied to those shell companies, she's been transferring property into her own name. If we move fast, we can challenge the transfers as fraudulent." It hit me like a gut punch. Daniel hadn't just betrayed me. He was betrayed in turn, cut open by the very person he trusted most. Betrayal was running full circle, and for the first time, I almost pitied him. Almost. That night, Daniel showed up again, this time not in a BMW, but in a beat-up rental car. He barged into the cabin, eyes wild. "You turned them against me. You froze my accounts. What the hell are you doing?" I stood firm. What I should have done months ago. Protecting what's left? He slammed his fist on the table, rattling Margaret's photograph in its frame. "You think this makes you strong? You're destroying your own son." And that was when the third twist landed. I pulled out a recording device from my jacket pocket. the red light blinking. I'd captured every word, every threat, every admission. For weeks, I'd been quietly documenting, waiting for the moment he revealed his true self. Daniel's face crumpled as he realized. "You set me up," he whispered. "No," I said, my voice steady. "You set yourself up." I just stopped pretending not to see it. His rage broke then. He lunged toward me, but I didn't move. He froze halfway, like some invisible wall had hit him, because through the window he saw two men standing by the tree line, the same creditors from before. They hadn't left town after all. They'd been watching, waiting. That was the fourth twist. I wasn't the only one ready to hold him accountable. Daniel backed away slowly, his breathing ragged. For the first time, he looked small, smaller than the boy in that old photograph with the perch. I thought it was over. But then my phone buzzed. A new message lit the screen. It wasn't from Daniel or the creditors. It was from an unknown number. The text read, "We know about the cabin. We know about the envelope. If you don't hand it over, you'll lose more than your son." I stared at the words as the fire popped and hissed beside me, the air suddenly colder than the Michigan winter outside. Someone else was in the game now, someone who knew too much. And for the first time since Margaret died, I realized this fight wasn't just about family anymore. It was about survival. The text glowed on my phone like a warning flare. "We know about the cabin. We know about the envelope." For a long minute, I just stared at the screen, the firelight flickering against my hands. Whoever had sent it wasn't Daniel's creditors. They were too blunt, too reckless. This message was different, precise, calculated. Carter met me the next morning at the diner in Lansing, the place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like burnt beans. I slid my phone across the table. He read the message, then looked me in the eye. "This isn't random, Richard." Someone close to Daniel. Someone who's been watching both of you. And that's when the final twist revealed itself. Daniel's girlfriend, the one who had been transferring properties into her name, was behind it. She hadn't just been using Daniel. She'd been tracking me, waiting for the moment she could pry the cabin and Margaret's documents out of my hands. We filed an injunction that same day, challenging her transfers as fraudulent. The judge froze her assets pending investigation. By the end of the week, law enforcement had enough evidence to charge her with fraud and conspiracy. But Daniel wasn't spared either. When the authorities dug deeper, they found forged signatures, shell companies, and evidence of tax evasion. Every lie he'd told, every shortcut he'd taken, unraveled like a loose thread pulled too far. He wasn't the golden businessman anymore. He was a defendant, standing under fluorescent lights in a courtroom. The same creditors who once feared him, now testifying against him. I sat in the back row the day the verdict was read. Daniel's face was pale, his suit too big for him now. He glanced at me once, eyes hollow, and for a moment I almost didn't recognize the man who'd once balanced on my shoulders to hang Christmas lights. The judge's voice was steady, guilty on multiple counts. Sentence, years in federal prison, restitution to creditors, and forfeiture of assets, including the Ann Arbor house. That house, my house, was returned to me through legal right. The irony was sharp. Daniel had stolen it from me, gambled it away, and in the end, the law handed it back. After court, I drove to the Lake Huron cabin. Snow still clung to the pines, the lake frozen solid in the distance. I built a fire, poured a glass of bourbon, and pulled Margaret's letter from the wooden chest. Her words echoed in my head. "Don't be afraid to protect what's ours." For the first time in years, I felt peace. Not triumph, not gloating, just peace. My son had chosen his path, and I had finally chosen mine. The final twist wasn't about money or houses or even revenge. It was about survival, about knowing when to stop bleeding for someone who only wanted to drain you dry. And so, that's how it ended. Daniel lost everything he thought he controlled, his fortune, his freedom, his pride. And I regained what mattered most, my dignity, my home, and the quiet certainty that Margaret's faith in me had not been wasted. Looking back now, I've learned something simple but hard. Love doesn't mean surrendering your soul, and family doesn't give someone the right to destroy you. Sometimes, protecting what's left is the bravest thing you can do. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted most? Maybe not with money, maybe not with houses, but in ways that left you questioning everything. Share your story in the comments. I'll be reading them. And if my journey meant something to you, stay with me here. There are more stories to tell, and maybe together we can make sense of them.